Welcome back, everybody. Today we'll be talking about knife locks, the systems that pocket knives have to keep the blade open. So, let's get into it. First up, we have a non-locking knife, but it's technically a lock because, it keeps the blade from closing. It's legally not a lock, technically a lock. Make it what you will. This is probably what most people are familiar with. You go, like your grandpa's bone-handled, 3-blade Stockman, Swiss Army knife. These are what are called spring locks, springbacks. It varies a bit depending. But you just pull the knife blade out, and it just kind of clicks into place. But there's no gizmo keeping the blade from closing. There's just some tension to just keep it from gravity pulling the blade down. This is probably the most standard knife system out there. It's just a simple springback system. Spring lock. Slip joint. That's what I'm trying to say. Slip joint. Oh, that escaped me. This is what is called a slip joint. It is a joint that slips into place. That is the first, what I am going to consider the first locking mechanism. Now, there's more locking mechanisms and knives out there than what you see here before you, but this is a good range of what I think is most commonly out there. To reiterate, we've got a slip joint. Classic, old as time. That's how a pocket knife works. Now let's take it up a step. Instead of having a completely rounded back, if the camera will focus, the back of this knife blade has a little divot in the tang here. That divot is to receive a little bump that's on this back bar here that will keep that blade from closing shut. The only way to close this knife is to pull this blade out, usually with a tab somewhere on the back of the knife that you push down, which releases the tab up here, and you can close the knife blade. This is a very old system. It's been around since I think it's been around since like the 1860s or something, but I'm not positive. Don't quote me on the history of these locks. But this is a step up from a Victorinox slip joint. It's basically a slip joint that has a little divot in the handle to push the slip joint spring bar in the back, and it has a little tab up here which digs into the base of the blade, forcing it to stay open. There is no way you can close that and without pushing that thing down. That is the second lock system. This is what's called a lock back, because the lock is on the back of the knife. Next up, we have an Opinel. This is an Opinel number 9, one of my favorite models from Opinel, and it has a ring lock system. This is very old. This is from like 1890s or something. You open up the blade, you take this little barrel ring here on the outside, and you twist that. And now the path of the blade is blocked, forcing the blade to stay open. Very safe. And this is one of the few lock systems that, if it's made right, can lock the blade shut. Like, there's no way that's coming open. You can sometimes, due to the springiness of this, you can get a little bit of that out, but you're not going to have a lot. And if you really wedge it down, you're not getting anything. But if you twist that to where this whole gap is open, this will come out. And then twist to close, and that won't close. This is a very old lock system. One of my favorite. It's not fidgety or fast by any means, but it's secure. That is a barrel ring, a ring lock system. Joseph Opinel invented that in like 1880, 1890-ish, somewhere in there. Let's move on to the next lock. Next up, we have the Walker liner lock. You flick open a knife. If you see no little divot on the back like you do with this guy, no barrel ring, it's not going to be one of those locks. It's probably going to, 9 out of 10 knives out there in the world are a liner lock. And as you see here, part of this inside of this liner, on this knife we have scales, liners, spacers, liner, scale. The liner of this knife has a little cut to allow part of it to spring over into the path of the blade. If you push that back, the blade can close. But as soon as the blade is out of the range, it slips into place. And these are made to be one-handed. You don't have to two-hand a lot of these knives. About the only one you have to two-hand are these. They're from here on, with the exception of this, it's all one-hand oriented. Very one-handy, usually fidgety to an extent if they're made right. This is one of the most common and one of the more secure. Not the most secure. There's several that are more secure, like Cold Steel's Triad Lock, which is basically this with another little gimmick in the top. But Walker Liner Lock. Just call it a liner lock. This is probably the most common lock system on a knife. Next up, we have a variation of the liner lock called a frame lock. This knife has no liners, no scales. It just has frames. And part of that frame is cut out, and you can kind of see a little bit more clearly how that action works. The blade opens up, the lock tab slips into the path of the blade, preventing it from closing. There's no way that can close. And frame locks, to me, are a little bit more secure than liner locks because the lock tab is usually thicker, because the frame is usually thicker than liners, as you can kind of see here. This is a very good one to have. I personally like frame locks. And they're also easier to clean because there's nothing with this. You know, there's that gap between the liner and the scale that pocket gunk, dirt, sand can collect, and it's a little tricky to clean without disassembling. This knife you can pretty much clean without disassembling because it's just 3 layers, and then the washer's in the middle. But the washers don't usually collect that much grime. Next up on these is a variation of a liner lock called the compression lock. Now, it is not a flat tab that slips into the divot of the blade. There's actually like a little groove carved out of the blade here that this little bump slips into. The blade has this cutout and the lock tab slips in, creating several different directions of pressure. Now, this is a PM2 clone. For those of you that want to rat me out, this is a clone. Don't worry about it. It's just here for visual reference on how a compression lock works. But it's on the back of the knife blade. So far, all of these knives, you have to have your fingers somewhere in the path of the blade when you go to close, which is not a big deal, but if you're a non-knife person, that can be a bit of an issue. With this, the fingers stay out of the way of the lock system. When I actuate the lock, I can snap that blade shut. It's again with the burps when I'm doing a video. The fingers stay out of the way when you're doing the locking. And you just hold the side of the scales, sometimes with several fingers, 2 fingers, depending on how you feel. Just push that down out of the way. The blade can now close. Compression locks are very fun. I personally love compression locks. They're personally very fun. Next up, another finger out of the way kind of deal is Benchmade's Axis Lock. And what this does is the tang of the blade has a little bit of a ramp here in the back that this barrel slides up on to stop that blade from closing. You can Google cutaways of these locks and see more clearly how they work. But the Axis lock is a very solid, one of the more solid locks out there, and it kind of tensions up as the metal gradually wears down over the years. Doesn't need a lot of maintenance, and I haven't had an Omega spring fail on me yet. They're usually quite good. But Benchmade's Axis lock like last year, 2 years ago, went up for grabs on the patents. The old patent wore out, and now it's free to use by pretty much anybody that wants to use it. And I think that's a good thing, because this is a very reliable lock system and very fidgety. As you can see here, very one-handed. I personally like digging 2 fingers into both sides of the lock. This is an ambidextrous lock. Righties and lefties can use this. So far, all these others are, require 2 hands or right hand favored. But this is totally ambidextrous. Very nice. Now, SOG has their version called the XR lock. It's very similar to how this functions. And then we have kind of a cross between the Axis lock and a slip joint here on this Victorinox Swiss tool. When I pull out the knife blade, watch the little gritty bar there. You see how that moves back out of the way, then clicks in? This fuzzy gritty part is basically the crossbar lock. And then the tool has kind of a slip joint spring system on the back. And due to the crossbar system, this knife cannot close without me pulling this out. But without that, you can kind of feel the spring want to pull that open. Like if this failed, you still have some retention just with the spring alone. So that is a good lock system. Next lock system, fixed blade. Knife doesn't move, very simple, very attenuative and intuitive to those non-knife people. Now, this video is kind of a response to Zach in the Wild's video from earlier today when this was filmed, where he went around and passed knives out to people and tried to see how they reacted, how did they open these knives. A lot of these people were taking knives, they didn't know which end was which, and they're taking 2 hands opening, 2 hands closing, even on very one-handed oriented knives. Knives that a lot of us knife people can just do this with. They're sitting there like, which end is which? Oh, here we go. And then they're like, okay, how does this thing close? They don't know how it closes. And then when they do get it to close, they go 2 hands and close it. And I don't quite agree with what Zach said. Zach said that probably the most intuitive lock to non-knife people is the benchmade Axis lock. And he says that, the lock screams, here I am, this is how the knife works. I beg to differ. If you're not a knife person, you don't even know how this knife is set up. A lot of people can be kind of scared of knives, and this isn't good for the knife community. There should be a more public awareness of, like, how do knives open? How do knives work? Some knives I understand. That, like this one, if you don't know knives, which end is which, it isn't the clearest at points. But I feel like this one is very clear which end is which. I feel like most of these are clear which end is which. This one I'll let you have. Okay, which side is which? There's not a lot of billboarding on how that operates. I get that. Swiss Army knives, you kind of have the idea because you see the fingernail divot there in the blade. But even that, I think if you're a non-knife person, no knife other than a fixed blade is intuitive. Because a fixed blade, you understand. Sheath, handle sticking out of sheath, you grab it by the handle, and there's the knife. There's no way to close it, there's no way to open it, because this is how it is. It's going to stay open, it is open, it will be open. These knives open and close, and if you don't know the mechanics of how knives work, you're not going to know how these work. It's just that simple. I don't think this is that intuitive to non-knife people on how that blade releases. Now, yes, after a few minutes of looking at it, people will figure it out. But if you're out in public, someone says, hey, you got a knife? And you pass them a knife. You pass them this. They might figure out that that can open that direction. They'll probably open it with 2 hands, like that. But they're not going to know how it's going to close. Unless they watch it super carefully when they open it. You know, like they see that little lock tab slip when you open the knife. I don't think they're going to get it. And it was painful watching that video. It was a fun pain. It wasn't bad pain, but it was a fun pain watching those poor people that Zach dragged over to the corner of the mall and said, "Here, open this knife." And they're sitting there trying to figure these things out. Fun video, Zach. I loved it. And I think that was very good, very informational, but I do not quite agree with your opinion on that. But if you agree with that, if that's what you think with the benchmade axis lock, you think that, I think I will stick with one of these two. The question at the end of Zach's video, go check it out. I'll try to link it below. If I don't link it, just look up Zach in the Wild. You'll find his content. Passing a knife to a non-knife person, I think you should stick with a slip joint or a fixed blade, because I think those are very intuitive. Now, this may be not intuitive to open and immediately. They may not know which end is which, but there's no lock system to stop them from closing it. Whereas everything else requires some sort of a gimmick to close it. And I just don't think that's good for non-knife people. Like Zach said, you know, people will take a liner lock or a frame lock. You pass it to them, they'll open it, and you do the thing with it, but they'll pass it back to you with the knife open because they don't know how to close it. And that's kind of a shame, because like the frame locks are like super obvious to me, but that's to me. As someone who's spent years with knives, that is super obvious. If you pass me pretty much any knife, I think I could open it. I haven't come across any that I haven't been able to open within like 5 seconds. The only knife I don't have here is an out the front OTF, but that's not really a locking knife as much as it is a flick knife. Like it's not really locked open or locked closed, and I don't think that really counts. These knives here all count as lock knives. Now, I threw these on the end of the scale because I think these are what should be intuitive to most people. I think if you got this sheath on your belt, you pull this out. So, you know, someone's like, "Hey, you got a knife." You pull this out and you pass it to them. There's no trouble. It's open. They can take it. They can pass it back. There's no hassle trying to figure out what does what. This, you know, most people have seen a Swiss Army knife. I think they'll figure that out, especially if it is a Swiss Army knife. If it's one of those like Grandpa's bone-handled, you know, Stockman knives, that may not look as the same. So that's my video on knife locks and how they work. I know I've missed some knives. This is all the different lock systems that I have in my collection. If there's a lock missing, it's because I don't have a knife with that lock. So, I hope you found this video informational. If you're new to knives, you know, you can watch how these are opened and closed. But this is also just kind of a fun back and forth banter with Zach in the Wild. We'll see what he has to say about this. I know my way of saying stuff in videos isn't the best. I'm not the best speaker. I'm good at reading text that you give me to come up with text on the go. Not so much, but I hope you found this video useful, informational, and somewhat fun. I try to put a little bit of fun somewhere in the video. And thank you all for watching. I hope to see you all in the next video. And until then, bye-bye.